Welcome to State of Tech. My name's Jared, and I'm here with the Razer Blade and the Razer Core with a GTX 1080, slightly overclocked. And I wanted to talk to you about the performance. So we're kind of doing a review of this. Those of you who have been around on this channel for a little while may remember I did kind of an unboxing and initial setup video for the Razer Core. And it's taken me some time to come back and actually do a review of it because, you know, I just haven't had time to spend using it to its full extent and actually, you know, play a couple of games and see the performance on the laptop itself versus having the Razer Core with the 1080. And then also do some video editing and some rendering so that I can really get a good idea of where this actually becomes a viable purchase or worth its money, I guess you could say. So this review is of the Razer Core with the GTX 1080 in it. I've got links in the description below to show you the exact GPU that I have so that you can, you know, kind of see exactly what I'm working with and the exact specs of that GPU. So the main thing that I do is video editing and stuff like that. So most of my experience here is with editing video. Now, what was also great about having this is that, you know, I take my laptop with me from my office every night. So when I leave my office, I unplug. When I come into my office, I plug in with a single Thunderbolt 3 cable and I connect this. And this Razer Core has 4 USB Type A ports in the back of it. Of course, it also has Ethernet. And with the GTX 1080 in the back of it, I have either HDMI or, of course, DisplayPort. And so with my monitor, I've got it plugged into DisplayPort, and I'm able to, you know, really just use this as a hub as well, as just a one-cable hub solution that also controls my monitor, that also provides extra power. And, you know, hubs have been around for a long time, and you can't really get excited about spending, you know, like $1,300 after this is all said and done just so that you can have a hub. But having a hub per se that actually adds performance to your system is important for those of you that want the maximum performance possible. So obviously there are some benefits to just having the external GPU because of the additional ports, you know, just being able to plug in easily. It definitely helps there. So let's talk about performance overall. Now I'm going to start with video editing because video editing is where I really saw the smallest amount of performance gains. Now, in editing 1080 footage, like, you know, we put together a lot of our videos like the one that you're watching right now in 1080. So we shoot them in HD, we edit them in HD, and we export them in HD to upload to YouTube. And where I saw a little bit of performance increase was in editing in HD. Now, when I had pretty much this exact same GPU, the GTX 1080 that's got a little bit of overclocking done to it, when I had that in a tower, and I was rendering out full HD video, I would render back at slightly better than real time. So say for example, I was rendering out an 8-minute video, it might take 6.5 minutes to render it out. Now, of course, that's in a tower with, you know, 64 gigs of RAM, a much more stronger CPU, so your processor is much more powerful, and then just everything is bigger. There's the throughput, the band, everything is better. You're not going to run into throttling issues or really any issues with data travel throughout the different components of your system when you're on a tower. So when I edit with this, I don't see as good of performance gains. So for example, we really wanted to put it through its paces, and so we used one of our 4K videos that we've shot. Now, I'm sitting in front of a green screen, and we shoot a lot of our videos in here on the green screen because with our different YouTube channels and the different videos that we put out, it's just easier to put in a digital background behind us than it is to have all of these different video sets. So our videos there's a chroma keying going on across the entire video, which is processor intensive when it comes to rendering. There's also some motion graphics, usually at the beginning and at the end. Sometimes during the middle, if we throw a couple of photos up and kind of animate them in, or other video footage and animate it somehow. most of these videos are pretty intense. They're not going to render out that easily, and especially being that they're 4K footage, these files, like for say an 8-minute long video, is probably going to be 2.5 gigs in size, and it's a lot more. It takes a lot more resources to render something out like that. So we tested a video file out on just the Razer blade itself with the 1060 that's inside of it, made sure that all of the effects and everything were rendered ahead of time or pre-rendered, and so really it was just running the final rendering job out, and we saw around a 33-minute time on that render project. Now this wasn't an extremely long video, and we're throwing some specs up on the screen for you to see, but it definitely was a decent sized project, and 33 minutes or 34 kind of in between minutes is quite a bit of time to wait for a video to render, but it is 4K, and one of the cool things is that even with the GTX 1060 that's inside the Razer, in Adobe Premiere Pro, we were able to have actually full playback, so full quality playback within Premiere Pro without having to go down to half or quarter playback. So it really handled the playback well. Now, when we switched over to the GTX 1080, we saw, basically the same types of results. We were able to view back 4K footage in real time without any skipping or frame jumping or jitteries or anything like that. And we were rendering out the same project. We saw about a 3 to 4 minute improvement. So take that 33, 34 minutes, cut it down to basically exactly 30 minutes. And so you're saving, yourself maybe 3 or 4 minutes on a render job of about that size. Now, if you're rendering out, something that's an hour long, like maybe you edited a short film or even a feature-length film or something like that, of course you're going to see a better improvement because the project is larger, so the distance between the 1060 and the 1080 is going to show more. But in this almost 10-minute long video that we rendered out, there was really only about 4 minutes of savings having used the GTX 1080. So that really calls into question, if you are a creative, a video editor like me, is it worth spending the extra money to get that kind of performance when, technically I could just get a USB hub and plug my monitor straight into the side of my laptop and really only be about 3 to 4 minutes slower. So in my opinion, the Razer Core with the GTX 1080, with the specs below, keep in mind that just the day before yesterday, NVIDIA did announce a bunch of new lines for 2017. So who knows what kind of performance gains we would get there. But what that's also telling me, because I know a 1060 is not that close in power to a 1080, what that's telling me is that there is issues with the PC itself, with this Razer blade itself, not being able to utilize all of that performance that's in this 1080 that's inside of here, because of the RAM being only 16 gigabytes of RAM, the CPU not being, a desktop powerful CPU that I would use if I had that in a tower. So there's bottleneck issues happening there. And for those of you that are maybe know a little bit more, I did have when I did this render test, we did the 1060 straight with the laptop, nothing plugged into it, just with the laptop. And then when we did the 1080 render test, we did the 1080 render test with the Razer Core connected to a monitor, because if you use the Razer Core like you see it here, Razer Core plugged into the laptop and you use the laptop display, there's a full loop happening going on with your data. All of the information is going out to the GPU to be processed, and then the GPU is having to send it all back to your display, along with whatever it's doing for rendering and any other processes that it's doing. Whereas if you are plugged into a monitor, if you have a monitor or a display plugged into the back of your Razer Core, that's less data it's going to have to send back. So there's less bottlenecking happening there. So I recommend that if you are going to go with a setup like this, like doing this right here isn't going to be the ideal. You're going to want to plug a display into the Razer Core and use it that way. So in video editing, just not that big of an increase in performance to justify the cost. I mean, I can get, you know, a nice looking hub that does some, you know, breakout cable or something like that for significant less money and not have to worry about all of that extra cost. Now, in gaming, I don't do a whole lot of gaming, but I do enjoy playing Forza Motorsport 6, and that is a fun game to me, and it is a little intense on the processor at times, on the GPU, of course, at times, and I do see much better performance increases when it comes to games. Now, that could be simply just because of the way the games are developed. The games are developed, and NVIDIA develops their software and their drivers to work with these games, and so there's a lot more happening there behind the scenes that was designed to happen that way. You know, Adobe Premiere Pro isn't optimized to work with external GPUs and stuff like that yet. And this is still a buggy system, which I'll talk about next. But in gaming, I did see better performance. When connected to my monitor with the GTX 1080 in Forza 6, I was able to get just above 60 frames per second consistently. No matter what, I never saw it dip below 60 frames per second. And to me, that's pretty acceptable. I mean, the game feels great, it flows really well at 60 frames per second. However, when I play the game on just the laptop alone with nothing plugged into it, I'm seeing a substantial decrease in frames per second and overall game performance because the GTX 1060 just isn't holding itself up like the 1080 is. So in gaming, I feel like you get a lot better performance out of having the Razer Core, which of course, that's what it was designed for. It was designed for those of you that game. You know, these big processors, these big GPU processors are more designed for gaming than they are for video editing. So, you know, it makes sense that you would get more performance out of a game than you would out of video editing. So it's just kind of interesting. I found that to be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to doing more testing in performance increases in games versus video editing, just to see the difference in some of these processors, these GPUs. It's just interesting to me to see what works and what doesn't. And you know, everybody always thinks, you know, a 1060 is much slower than a 1080. Well, in this situation, it's not really, because of the circumstances and the way that the hardware works together. So let's talk about overall just how well this system works. Now, I've never really had a problem plugging in the Razer Core to the laptop and then the laptop bypassing the 1060 and using the 1080 while using the laptop display. But plugging in a monitor into the Razer Core, once or twice a week I would run into issues where it wouldn't connect. I would have to power cycle the Razer Core. Sometimes I'd have to power cycle my laptop. If Razer Synapse, which is a piece of software that runs on your Razer Blade, had an update and I ran that, but there wasn't a NVIDIA update, sometimes it would break and I'd end up not being able to use the Razer Core at all for that day until the software update for the other one would come through. Sometimes there'd be an NVIDIA update and then a day or two later would be a Razer Synapse update, and in between I would have problems connecting, and it was just very buggy. It always seemed like one thing would break the other, and today I'd had the worst of that scenario. I had software updates, it wouldn't work, I had a black screen, I could see the cursor and I'm wiggling it around, but the screen wouldn't come on. I'm power cycling. I actually had to run the software update for NVIDIA over again and restart my computer. And then there was a Windows update on my computer that had to run. And once all those things ran and I power cycled everything again, I finally was able to get it to work. But that was like almost an hour of lost time today. And you know, when I'm at work and I'm trying to get stuff done, an hour of lost time is valuable time that I'm not going to get back. And it happened because of this system right here. So of course it hasn't been horribly buggy. It just happens every now and then that there's a situation like that. Something will stop working. I have to run some updates. I have to power cycle, and then it works again. But that's kind of the PC life anyways. Nobody's PC, if you build it yourself or if you modify it or do something that's kind of out of the ordinary, there's one little update is going to affect other things and you're going to have issues. It's just the way that it is. So some of you are much more patient people than me and can deal with that stuff. For me, it was really kind of a pain and it bummed me out quite often whenever it would happen. So the bottom line comes down to is buying a Razer Core for $400 or $500, depending on the price you get it for, and then buying a GPU for the inside of that Razer Core, is it worth the money? Now, I think that if you are a gamer, it is. Because you probably went with a Razer Blade because you wanted to be mobile. You are thinking about wanting more horsepower, like a Razer Core, and putting a 1080 inside of it because you want more performance for when you do want a game. You know that the 1060 just isn't really going to cut it. So it's worth it, I think. I would hope that maybe the prices would come down on some things, but you're going to have to at least put a 1080 in here. If you put a 1070 in here, or even the 1060, you're not going to see any performance upgrades. You really need to go with a 1080 or maybe even one of the new models that NVIDIA just released this last week that are going to be becoming available pretty soon. That is what I think you need in order to get the kind of performance. Now, thankfully, in games, they're usually less CPU and less RAM intense than video editing, and I think that's where the Razer Core is able to provide more power for gaming because those games are not so processor intensive or RAM intensive, and so the bottlenecking doesn't happen quite as bad with gaming that it does in video editing. With video editing, you're using a lot of RAM, you're using a lot of CPU, and then you throw a lot of GPU into the mix, and you're gonna have bottleneck issues when you're dealing with a small framed laptop such as the Razer Blade. So I hope that all of that kind of helped you understand a little bit more about what a Razer Core is good for. I can't knock it and say, oh, it's a horrible product, because it's not. And Razer is one of the first people to do it. And they actually did do a pretty good job at putting this together. And considering that there isn't much on the market as far as external GPUs go, it's pretty darn stable in the grand scheme of it all. But just as another note, you will need to install the drivers for the GTX 1080 or whatever GPU you put in, which means adding additional software from NVIDIA to your laptop. You're also going to have to go and download a GPU switcher from Razer's website, and that GPU switcher is just an application that's in beta that runs in the background, and it recognizes when you attach another GPU, and then it switches on the fly between your internal 1060 and your external 1080. So don't just think that you could just plug all this in and it's going to work. You're going to need to download the appropriate software, the NVIDIA Experience or whatever software from NVIDIA's website to get the GTX 1080 and have software updates come through fairly easily and not have to go to NVIDIA's website every time, which I find very important, considering that when there's a Razer Synapse update, it's just so much easier with the GTX, with the NVIDIA Experience application running in the background, easier to get those software updates. So there are a few pieces of software you're going to have to install and configure, but once it's all set up and done, you're going to have a blazing fast experience playing games and a very slight increase in performance when editing video. So hey, thanks so much for checking this out. I have a full review coming of my Razer Blade. Now I've got a review up of the Razer Blade Core, or the Razer Core. So if you like our videos, give them a thumbs up, lets us know that we're doing a good job, and give us a channel subscribe so that you'll be notified when we put out more videos here on State of Tech. Thank you so much for checking out State of Tech. You can also follow us on Instagram and over on Facebook, just at State of Tech, or do a search for it and you'll find us. Thanks so much. Don't forget that those links are in the description below, and we'll see you next time.